Here we are at session number 47. We're today looking at Habakkuk 1 verses 5 and 6. We've entitled it God's Terrible Plan. Likely a better title would be God's Terrifying Plan. Well, Habakkuk was active at a time when Israelites believed God would not let any nation defile Jerusalem or the temple because of his presence. But God had warned Judah against thinking Jerusalem was invincible because of the temple and his presence. For example, in Jeremiah 7:4, God said this to Jerusalem, "Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord." This mantra was a form of idolatry and created a false sense of security. Therefore, if Jerusalem were to fall into exile by a foreign nation, a theological crisis would occur among the people because Jerusalem was sacked when God was present. Well, that wasn't exactly what happened, but that was likely the thinking at the time. Again, it was a time of internal crisis in Judah because of the corruption and the injustice that Habakkuk had highlighted in his complaint. And it was a time of international crisis as well, because Assyria was going down the tubes. It was descending in terms of power. So was Egypt. And at the same time, Babylon was rising in power. Now, Assyria was a vile, evil nation, but Babylon was even more so. So let's look at God's response to Habakkuk beginning in verse 5. And in verse 5, we see God's initial response to Habakkuk's complaint. Let's look at verse 5. Look among the nations. This is God speaking to the people of Judah. Look among the nations and see, wonder, and be astounded. For I am, not will be, I am doing a work in your days that you wouldn't believe it if you were told. That was God essentially saying, Habakkuk, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now, we don't know how long God had been silent or the length of time between verses 4 and 5, between Habakkuk's complaint and God's response. We have no sense of what that timing was between verses 4 and 5. It's probably fairly short, but we don't know. By the way, in verse 5, that second person, you, is plural. So God's response was to all the people, not just Habakkuk. Habakkuk was God's mouthpiece to God's wayward people, and all Judah was to listen up. Paul, one time, speaking at a synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, not the Antioch of Syria, but another Antioch northern from that particular version. He was on one of his first missionary trips, and he used the same verse as a wake-up call. Acts 13, I'm going to read verses 40 and 41. Therefore, lest what is said in the prophets should come about, look, you scoffers, be astounded and perish. For I am doing a work in your days, a work that you will not believe, even if one tells it to you. So there's Paul quoting Habakkuk, but notice he doesn't name Habakkuk, which is all the way through the New Testament. Wherever Habakkuk is quoted or referred to, he's not referred to by name, only as a prophet. So let's check some of the key words in verse 5. That's been our modus operandi here lately, so let's take a look at it. Wonder and be astonished, which could also be translated amazed, seem to imply that what's on the horizon would boggle the minds of Habakkuk and his audience. Well, let me ask you a question. Does verse 5 seem to imply that even what God is about to unveil isn't the whole story? And you know that is typical of the way God reveals information. It reveals only what he thinks is necessary. Likely it is true because of the word if told. That comment would seem to imply that there's some things that are not being told. Well, it's not clear, but it's likely the case. God's making it very clear that he was not ignorant of the situation Habakkuk was complaining about, nor was he inactive. He already said, I am doing a work. So he said he was already active. Habakkuk hadn't seen it. He didn't see the results he wanted, but God said he was already active. And he'd already been at work and knew what he was going to do. How long had God known what he was going to do? Well, that's an easy answer. As in all of God's knowledge is from eternity past. He has always known. He's never not known. So what did God say? If you want to put something up front to summarize what God had said, I think it looks something like this. Judah, you have too narrow a view. You only look at your internal problems. Take a wider world view and look at the godless Gentile nations around you. Judah was being told that if she looked around, her observation would leave her astounded, bewildered, dumbfounded. So the message seems fairly clear. Revival is probably not in the immediate picture. First must come a great work of Yahweh, probably judgment, and we will see that soon. Jeremiah had delivered a similar message to Judah at about the same time that Habakkuk was. Jeremiah 4:9, for example. Jeremiah is delivering a word from God to Judah, and it goes something like this in Jeremiah 4:9. In that day, declares Yahweh, courage shall fail both king and officials. And that happened, by the way. The priest shall be appalled and the prophets astounded. But then God's mighty works typically boggle the human mind. There's nothing unusual. I mean, God seldom does things like we think, or in the way we think, or in the timing we think. But as it turned out, God promised something spectacular, but not anything the Jews would have expected or really even wanted if they knew it ahead of time. Judah was not ignorant of this fact. Go back all the way to Deuteronomy 29, verses 24 and 25. This is those end time statements of Moses, the blessings and the cursings and so forth. And Moses is delivering these words to Judah. All the nations will say, why has the Lord done this to the land? In other words, it is God who is responsible for the judgment on Judah when it happens. What caused the heat of this great anger? Then the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. In other words, they didn't pay one bit of attention to the covenant or the law of Moses. So next, Yahweh delivers a devastating news concerning future happenings at the hand of a beautiful, but it's brutal Gentile nation. That's Babylon, or as we see in Habakkuk as Chaldeans. So verse 6, for behold, this is God speaking again, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that's the Babylonians effectively, that bitter and hasty nation, there's two words we'll want to check on, who march through the breadth of the earth, that's a bit of hyperbole more than likely, to seize dwellings not their own. In other words, they're coming to plunder. Haven't people through the generations wrestled with God's use of evil nations, even to bring judgment on his own people? Does that seem right? Well, absolutely, people have wrestled with it. The problem is generally based on an erroneous notion of what a loving God can and cannot do, or even what a loving act might be. Evidently, God believes that judgment is a loving act intended to turn a nation around and bring that nation back into right relationship with him. But it's devastating to the nation at the time. It's not a simple matter. So think about this. Are some of God's acts and attributes negative or even sinful? For example, his attribute of jealousy. Is God a green-eyed monster? I think we've raised this issue before. And the problem, of course, is when people see a term like jealousy or something that they take to be negative, they're ascribing to God the same motivations as you would ascribe to a human in that situation. No, God's not a green-eyed monster. His attribute of jealousy is a positive attribute, meaning he will take care of his people. You mess with his people, and you better be ready to back off. Well, let's go back to a couple more words from here in verse 6. The word for tells us that what follows explains the amazement and unbelief that he's already said will overcome the people. He's told us that in verse 5. Bitter is translated fierce by some, ruthless by others. So it's a very nasty title. Bitter, fierce, ruthless. Hasty, same way. Impetuous or ferocious. So what you have is a bitter, fierce, ruthless nation which is impetuous, and ferocious. How do you stop them? That's the question. The phrase, the breadth of the whole earth, which we mentioned earlier, is likely hyperbole, because in that day it probably included only the Middle East, North Africa, and maybe the Mediterranean coast. But it certainly included Assyria, Judah, Egypt, Edom, Persia, and so on. But the whole world as we know it today, no, not likely. Most everybody knows, for example, that character produces conduct. You saw the character of the Babylonians that God had just given. And so you're going to see that character played out in their conduct as God continues his description. So the Babylonians or Chaldeans were known as a vile, cruel, evil nation, even worse than Assyria, and they're bent on conquest. They showed no mercy, they spared no pain. So it's likely that Habakkuk was pleading for a quick solution to the chaos he saw about him, but from his point, things were getting much worse before there would be any improvement. He was not hoping for this, for Babylon to get involved. He was hoping for something internal form of judgment, I suspect. Now, do you think the Judeans could believe that Babylon was to come upon their land, even at God's beck and call, that God would let such evil go unchecked? So, and that's what God's is going to tell them. Look, I'm bringing these guys in. They're doing my bidding. They're evil, and I'm going to let them do their thing, and as a form of judgment. So there, really, that's two questions rather than one. The second question first: will God let evil go unchecked? Yes. Will he let evil go unpunished? No. And Habakkuk was about to learn that lesson in chapter 2. That, yeah, Babylon's going to get out of control. God's going to let them remain out of control for a period of time, but then God will take punishment. He will take his vengeance. His wrath will be seen one day. So the first question, however, merits a longer discussion. Do you think the Judeans could believe that God would would let Babylon come upon their land at God's beck and call? Well, let's look Jeremiah 6 as a further piece of information. Jeremiah 6 verses 13 and 14. And this again is repeated in Jeremiah 8, 10, and 11. Jeremiah was making a strong point. He repeats it later. So here's God speaking of the Babylonians and the impending disaster. For from the least to the greatest of them, that's the Babylonians, everyone is greedy for unjust gain, and from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. So the claim I just made is wrong. That from the least to the greatest of them, he's talking about Judeans. Every Judean, he says, is greedy for unjust gain, and that includes the prophets and the priests who deal falsely. Everybody's dealing falsely. Verse 14, they have healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. In other words, they're lying about it. They said there's not going to be a problem when in fact there's going to be a very serious problem. So God had already set up this passage in chapter 5 of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 5 verses 11 and 12. For the house of Israel and the house of Judah have been utterly treacherous to me, declares the Lord. They have spoken falsely of the Lord and have said, he will do nothing. No disaster will come upon us, nor shall we see sword or famine. They want to bet? But it's amplified even further in Jeremiah 7, verses 8 through 11. And this is God speaking to Judah again. Behold, you trust in deceptive words to no avail, from the priests and the prophets of that day. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and come after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, only to go on doing all these abominations? You guys got to be kidding, I think he was saying. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Sounds like something Jesus said, right? Behold, I myself have seen it, says the Lord. Lord says, I know what's going on. And if you think you're going to get by with it, better think again. So here's a better question, perhaps. Can you accept God's use of some evil to bring you personally to repentance and back to himself? Can you deal with that notion that God would do that to get you to repent and return to him if you've wandered? But note what God really said about this situation with the Babylonians. He had ordained the Babylonians for this task as part of his plan. So check the sequence. The Judeans raised strife, it's in Habakkuk 1, 2, and 4. But God raised the Babylonians, Habakkuk 1, 6. A little bit of a comparison there. The Judeans cause problems. God stirs up even more problems for them in order to judge them and bring them back to himself. How is such an ordination possible, given your understanding of the nature of God? How can using the Babylonians be compatible with his attributes of love, justice, all those sorts of things? And with the promises he made to Israel to care for them, to support them. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is God's not human. He is above man, and he's entirely other in his existence. He's not one of us. So you cannot ascribe negative or evil motives to any of his actions, just as you would to a person doing those things. He is just, so whatever he does is just. He is love, so whatever he does is loving. He's immutable, so whatever he does is faithful to his promises and covenant. God says, I will do it, guaranteed. He will do it. He is immutable. He does not change. He cannot go back on his word. We often don't see the way God's actions support his nature. And the action or the acceptance that we do make has to come by faith. So, if we have a couple of takeaways, what would they look like? Well, I've got 2 or 3 of them here for you. We often fail to remember that God is other, well above the human sphere. Don't forget, God is not a man. He does not act as a man does with negative motives or to use his attributes with negative motives. There are always positive motives, all part of his plan from eternity past. When thinking of God's attributes, refrain from ascribing human-like motives to him. Do not use an attribute of God or a promise of God as an amulet or a good luck charm, as if it will compel God to do or act in some certain way, or that it prevents God from acting in some other way. God is sovereign. He acts according to his own choice. God is not always predictable in his doings. Matter of fact, many times, most times probably, he's not predictable. He's not one of us. His ways are higher. Be aware of the signs of the culture and the times. View them with a biblical worldview. Be willing to accept God's discipline. So look around you. Think of what you see in terms of what the Bible demands and describes as proper behavior. And if you do not, be willing to accept his discipline, whose sole purpose is to bring you back to himself. Well, in the next session, we'll examine some of the 5 verses, the next 5 verses, that more fully describe the Chaldeans and their characters and their actions. However, those 5 verses so loaded, I'm not even sure we're going to be able to finish all 5 of those in one setting. Nonetheless, I will look to see you next time. Good day.